Okay, everyone, so as we keep moving right along, it's time for us to talk about the Cambrian explosion today. So up to this point, life and creatures have been relatively simple. Movement was a big deal, a little bit of protection and all sorts of other stuff, but now things are going to get interesting from an evolutionary perspective. So if you think back to the previous lecture, we had relatively simple creatures like Sphrygia and Cambarella. And so, they were kind of like what we see today, but not really. And what scientists are kind of wondering is whether or not, and we talked about this before, the critters that we see today, are they related to these early creatures or not? And so, hint, hint, that was a quiz question. And remember, you're just supposed to be using your resources to address it, okay? And if you have questions, let me know. However, what we're going to focus on now is the time period after, okay? And in fact, this time period was so interesting that people called this the Cambrian explosion because of the fact that it basically was an explosion of all sorts of different body forms, also sorts of different body types. And remember that the Hox genes had come about by now, okay? And because they had, you could get all these different body types that evolved and, would be shown. And that was actually pretty cool. So I've mentioned them before, and I will mention them again. The trilobites are so cool. So look at these guys. They definitely have jointed appendages, okay? That's a big deal. And so that wouldn't happen until about we were well into 10 million years of the Cambrian. Trilobites would come about much later until the Cambrian was, let's say, about 20 million years old. So we're starting to get, things are really interesting in the later part of the Cambrian. But they are definitely coming about, okay? And the critters are getting interesting, and you can see they have a hard shell. This suggests that they were trying to protect themselves against something. Hint, hint. Perhaps there were predators around by then, and actually you guys are going to watch a video that will indicate this. But, things are definitely getting interesting. So one of the most interesting fossil places people have found is known as the Burgess Shale in British Columbia. Now, I got to tell you, I can kick myself because back in the day when I was in grad school, I actually drove by this place and I had no idea what the significance was because I hadn't, of course, taken enough evolutionary classes. And I could have actually visited it, which would have been so cool. And of course, I didn't, which is why I'm kicking myself. However, the Burgess Shale, which is in British Columbia, okay, and you will watch a video on it. This is probably the best record of creatures that we have during the Cambrian explosion. And it's definitely one of the most famous. It contained amazing sponges, comb jellies, worms, arthropods, brachiopods, chordates, all sorts of cool stuff, okay? And so, life was really happening at this point in time, and, the record of it happens to be here. So among the cool creatures we have, Opabinia is one of the most awesome ones. And so the Opabinia had chitin cover segments, they had feathery gills, they definitely looked like arthropods, they did not have any legs though. In addition to that, they were actually sporting 5 eyes and a grasping proboscis. Now how cool is this guy? Okay, so they definitely were, life was getting more and more complex. Wiwaxia is another creature that looks a bit interesting. I swear this could be me on a bad hair day. However, it looks like he has scales all over him, okay, which, might have been for protection or most likely is. Definitely look like an interesting creature. Another creature known as Hallucigenia. Now, this was named very much, based on what you think, that people, the scientists who discovered it felt like they were watching a bad, science movie, or they were hallucinating. So this critter is really interesting. And initially, they thought that the longest spikes were on the bottom, and that's what they walked on. But then they started to hypothesize that maybe it was the opposite, and the longest spikes were on top and were instead used for protection. Now, this guy's name is Anomalocaris, okay, and so it was inappropriately named because Anomalocaris means shrimp. And initially, when scientists discovered this fossil, they only discovered parts of it, and it would take them a while to discover the whole thing. Now, up to this point, everybody had been relatively small, but the Anomalocaris can actually be as big as up to 2 feet, at least according to the fossils. And so this is actually pretty cool because it's also hypothesized he was one of the first predators of his time, in which case, these guys are pretty impressive. So a little while ago, a scientist named Stephen Jay Gould, we talked about him quite a while ago, in fact, one of the first days of class. And so he was looking at the features of all of these guys, of the hallucinogen, amelocaris, and so forth, and he ended up writing this cool book, A Wonderful Life, okay? It's a play off of that movie, that Christmas movie from so long ago. That was also titled the same thing. And so I have to admit, I just purchased a copy of this book, and I found it at a used bookstore. I was super excited, and I can't wait to read it. And so I'll let you guys know how it is with time. But basically, he's talking about all the different critters and what they found, and what the interpretations are as far as what they meant for evolution today. So the big question we've had so far, and what keeps popping up to this point, is whether or not all of these critters are related to creatures that we have today. So perhaps the Wawaxia with all of those scales that stick up everywhere was related to a polychaete worm, or maybe some of the creatures were related to worms that we find in the ocean now. And there's really no easy answer because, again, we can't really go back in time to solve it. So, there are some suggestions that they might be related based on physical features, but, it's really hard to tell overall, and it's probably going to be debated for quite a while. So the big question now is, was this really an explosion, or is it just relative? And when, of course, did this all happen to occur? So the hypothesis is that maybe it took about 50 million years for all of this to radiate and go all over the place. Okay, you can see where the Cambrian is and located, and so 50 million years for all of these changes to take place. And people have tried to use genetic evidence from creatures that live today. They've tried to use fossil evidence. I mean, there really is no easy answer. From a practical perspective, 50 million years, what does that really mean? So keep in mind, humans have only been on Earth about 200,000 years. We've not even been here a million years yet, okay? So the idea of it truly being an explosion, that's kind of debatable. However, so it probably took much longer than people initially thought. It's just that everything's relative, and up to this point, everything was relatively small and plain and not super exciting. So when it did finally happen, it probably did legitimately earn the name explosion. So the purpose of this figure is to address when did these critters really start coming about, okay? And so on the left part of the slide, you see a tree, and you see porifera and cnidarians starting from the bottom up. Then we go to the echinoderms and brachiopods, and then we get to the more advanced arthropods. This correlates with the figure on the right, which is showing approximately when these critters started to come about, okay? So the poriferans, we know, have been around for quite a while. They were the first multicelled creatures. The cnidarians, them too. They've been around for, since the late Proterozoic into the Cambrian. Keep in mind, the oldest time period in that figure on the right is all the way to the right, and the newest time period is more towards the left, towards the tree, okay? So what I want you to get from this is, if you happen to look at this tree, no, you're not expected to memorize this by any means, but poriferans and cnidarians have been around for quite a while, okay? And the blue means the kingdom, phylum, class. Remember we talked about classes? That's when those classes evolved, and then order comes next, okay? So the more recent critters to evolve would be the mollusks, okay, the nematodes, the arthropods. Those guys came about more recently. This is kind of what you would expect, because the simplest critters came about first, and the more complex critters arrived later. So this, this just kind of gives you a nice timeline and explains when these creatures came about. Again, don't worry about memorizing it, just realize, kind of what was going on when. So the last part of the questions with regards to the Cambrian radiation is, besides when did it happen and how fast, is what caused it. Okay, so what triggered it. And there are several different hypotheses for this. And to be honest, it could be all of them, could be any combination. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So keep in mind, it could be all of them actually. So we know for a fact that the regulatory genes, the Hox genes, were around back then, and that's what gives us all of our different shapes and sizes that we know and love. Predator-prey interactions, that to me is one of the most interesting ones. So if you are prey, you have to find a way to outsmart and get away from your predators, otherwise you're going to get completely eaten. So then what you do is some trait evolves, and maybe spikes or a hard shell or something like that, and as natural selection does, if you happen to have this trait, then you will survive and produce more offspring than those that don't. But then your predators have to find ways to get around that. So then they tend to evolve traits that potentially help them get around that. And then it's kind of this coevolutionary arms race, and we'll talk more about that term later on in the semester. But what this does is it causes a lot of different species to form. Okay, so by predator and prey interacting with one another, the prey are trying to always outrun the predators and so forth. So this could very easily have contributed to the Cambrian radiation. Honestly, it's one of my favorite hypotheses, and I think it's one of the coolest ones. Another potential idea is the new ecological niches. Okay, and so, new resources coming about, new critters coming about, and so, exploiting these led to new creatures to evolve. Also, potentially, we know that there was, due to other lines of data, there was increased oxygen during this time period. More oxygen you have, maybe creatures can, come about more, especially based on how we define life. All right, and then also, now this is the controversial one, was there a mass extinction right before this, which would have opened up all of those new ecological niches and so forth. Now, figuring out which one of these, or, which of some of these, or however you want to do it, consider it, is going to be tough, because it very well could have been all of them that contributed to this, drastic shift in body plans. But, either way, it's pretty cool, and life was definitely getting interesting at this time point. Okay, everyone, so the way this class works, and it's one of my favorite parts, is that eventually we're going to be watching more and more videos. Now, it's not that I'm trying to be lazy by any means, but it's one thing for me to tell you about something. It's another for you to actually see it, okay? And so what I want you to do for the rest of the lecture today is watch the first 40 minutes of the David Attenborough First Life Part 2. So you can search for this a couple of different ways. You can go to YouTube and type in David Attenborough First Life Part 2. You can go to Google, type in YouTube, David Attenborough First Life Part 2. I don't care how you get there, okay? And so I want you to go to the video, and you'll watch up until about the first 38 minutes. Now, as you're watching this, I want you to pay attention to a couple of interesting things. First off, I want you to pay attention to the fact that they're actually using a critter that exists today known as the mantis shrimp to make inferences about the Anomalocaris. Okay, so the Anomalocaris, as we know, all went extinct long ago, but the mantis shrimp is hypothesized to be a distant relative of that. And so they're using modern-day mantis shrimps to study the Anomalocaris. And it's something that you can do in science if you've got, the proper controls and so forth. And it's a pretty neat thing to do because, definitely lets you get some information. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is there is definitely a time period in the video where David Attenborough is going to wave his fingers in front of a tank, and the mantis shrimp is just going to go after him. And he makes this huge clanking noise, okay? So what I want you to think about that is not just brush it off, but think about the last time you were in a pool, okay? Think about when you tried to kick really hard and so forth, and you probably didn't make any noise underwater whatsoever. So what I want you to think of is the power that this mantis shrimp must have inside of itself to be able to make that clicking noise as it's attacking the tank. It's really impressive, okay? And it definitely gives you a different perspective on these creatures. So the last part of lecture, go ahead and, watch the first 38 minutes of the video. It should, kind of put things in perspective. The next couple lectures, I have to see how I can embed the videos. I'm still experimenting with it, but I'm hoping everything is clear enough and this goes okay. And as always, if you need anything or you have any questions, please let me know. You guys know I'm always here to help, okay? Stay safe.